little late tonight, but we're going to go ahead and do the spiritual Q&A anyway. I'd like to encourage you, if you have questions, go ahead and send those in. You can send them in the Facebook page or Twitter or Periscope, wherever you happen to be watching, YouTube. Or if you have a different way to contact us, that's great too. Basically what we do is we just take questions that people send in or that people tell us, and we try and find biblical answers for them. And tonight, one of the questions that we'll start off talking about is, why are there so many different Bible translations? You can go to a store and there's tons of different translations. Some of them are the work of committees, like tons of people, like sometimes over 100, maybe several hundred people.
Like the King James Bible?
Yeah, like that's a translation where they have a committee.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the NIV had a committee that did it. The English Standard Version has a committee. Some translations, like the Message, I think Eugene Peterson did the Message. That was one guy translated that.
Wow.
But it's a paraphrase. So depending on what you're looking for will affect what kind of Bible you want, which translation you want. But some people have said, well, why are there so many? Shouldn't there just be one? And the answer to that is manifold. Right? There's lots of different ways that you can answer it. And part of the reason why there are so many different translations is because that's exactly what it is it's a translation of Greek and Hebrew into English. There's actually 4 languages that are written in the Bible: Greek, Hebrew, Chaldean, and Aramaic. And those 4 languages are what make up the text of the Old and the New Testaments. And unless you can read those languages, unless you can read ancient Hebrew, Chaldean, Greek, and Aramaic, Koine Greek specifically, unless you can read those things, then you need the Bible translated for you into English. And so when you go into a bookstore and you see all these different translations, there's not a whole bunch of different kinds of Bibles. There's one kind of Bible, generally speaking, and it has been translated by different groups of people. And the reason why I say generally speaking is because if you're familiar with a Catholic or a Greek Orthodox Bible, they have some extra books or some different books in it, books in addition to what you would find in like the English Standard Version. But generally, there's just those 2 flavors. You can call it Protestant if you want, and then High Church or Catholic or Orthodox if you want. But basically, those are the only 2 kinds of Bibles, and they're all translations of those 4 languages. And so when you go into a bookstore, basically what you're paying for is somebody to translate those ancient documents into a modern language so you can read it. So the NIV and the ESV and the CSV or CSB and all these different Bible versions, they're just translations. Right? There's not different Bibles. There's different English translations. Well, that still bothers some people. They're like, we should just pick one and kind of make it official. The problem with that, and a lot of people want to pick the King James Version. They're like, well, it's the first English translation of the Bible. It's not. There are other English translations of the Bible that come before the King James Bible. There's the Wycliffe Bible, and there's the Geneva Bible, and there's others. So the King James Bible isn't first. Another problem with the King James Bible, and it's a fine Bible, I'm just kind of throwing out reasons why it's not so simple as let's just pick that one and use it, is if you have a King James Bible and you set it down next to an NIV, for example, you're going to notice that there are some differences. Not just in the way things are rendered, but the King James Version will have extra verses in it. That's because we're finding out that as the Greek manuscript is passed down through time, sometimes there are additions or there are changes that kind of get rolled into what we would call textual families. So if you lived in England and you're a monk, right? This is before King James. So if you're a monk in the 1100s in England, and you're sitting in a scriptorium, and your scriptorium, is it torum or torium?
I don't know.
The room where they wrote the Bible. And so you're in a room with 100 other people, and there's a guy at the front reading, and he reads a line, and you're sitting there and you're scribbling it in the dark. You might have a candle on your desk, and you're sitting there writing it. And when he's done, he doesn't go back and read the line again. He moves on to the next. And you better remember what he said, because that's it. He's got too much to read to sit and wait for you to catch up. He's not going back. And so what if you're like halfway through and he starts reading the next line and you have to hurry up, or maybe you leave some words out because now you're in a hurry and you get down to the next line, and then later there's a fire at the monastery and all of the other copies are burned up in the fire except for yours because you didn't finish it and you were embarrassed and you stuck it in your you put it in your monk's quarters or whatever. And then later when you run out of the monastery to save your life, then now that's the one copy that is surviving from your monastery. And that is the copy that will get passed down with a line missing that you left out, or you missed words because you were sleepy that day and you didn't pay attention. So there's things like that that wind up entering in to the different copies that we have. And when you lay all of the copies that we have side by side, you can see, oh, well, this whoever wrote this one, added a word, or they left a word out, or they misheard whoever was reading. Because some of the Greek words are very similar to one another. One of the big words that gets argued about in the 4th century is homoousis and homoousis. I think I'm not saying it right because I don't have it in front of me. But similar substance and same substance. They're talking about the Trinity, and the difference between those two words is one letter, and it's hard to hear. And so if you're in a room and there's echoes and it's dark and you're not, you're tired, maybe you just ate lunch, and anyway, so I mean, it's really easy to mishear what is said. And so we can look back and we can see all these differences, and we can see how they crept in, where there were mistakes made, where there were omissions. Sometimes a scribe would maybe make a marginal note, and that marginal note eventually gets entered into the text. We can go back and we can take all that stuff out, and we can say this wasn't here in the original. And the King James Version in the 1600s, they just didn't have a lot of that information. And so a lot of those things that got added in when they were making that Bible, producing that Bible in English, all of those additions were there. And so that's why it's not as simple as saying, well, let's just pick one, and then let's just use that one. Because there are differences in some of the Greek texts, and you have to go back and look at all of them to see, all right, where did those differences come in, and where do we need to take them out, or how do we need to take them out? And then on top of that, let's say we can finally figure out the Greek text perfectly 100%. And now, how are we going to translate it into English? Are we going to try and do it 100% literally, or are we going to allow for some flexibility in the way we translate it? You can't translate languages in a 1-to-1 ratio. Right? It doesn't work that way. If you've ever used Google Translate, like if you're going to take a college class or a high school class, a language class, you can't just go to Google Translate and type stuff in English and hit the translate button and then copy and paste that Spanish into your assignment and turn it in. You will fail, because the Spanish language has a different logical construct than English. And so you have to move things around. There are idioms that don't translate, like the English idioms that we use all the time and we don't even think about it, like being in the hot seat, right? Like if I ask you a question right now and you weren't prepared for it, you're in the hot seat. That's not a Spanish idiom, right? A cat on a hot tin roof, things like that. They don't literally mean what you say. So how do you move that over into another language? Well, you have to know both languages so you can take the idea from one and put it in a way that a reader or a native speaker in the other will understand. That's how you can tell when somebody is trying to speak English and they're not a native speaker, because they say silly things. Right? It's not silly to them, but you as a native speaker, you're like, well, we don't say it like that. Yeah. This is how we say it. And so now you have to deal with that in the Greek too. Translations that try to be 100% literal are terrible English translations. They're hard to read. The words are out of order. There are articles that are missing, like a and the. It's crazy. It's difficult. Some of the sentences in Greek are really, really, really long. Like Ephesians chapter 1 is basically one long sentence. That you don't do that in English, right? That's just not how it works. And so now you have to figure out, all right, well, how do we move things around? Well, sometimes you want something that's more literal. When do you think that you would want a Bible that's more literal?
Like actually says what it says?
Yeah.
When you're trying to figure out what a certain word was, maybe?
Yeah, like if you're doing word studies, you would want a Bible that sticks more to the original text. Like the English Standard Version does a pretty good job of that. The New American Standard does a pretty good job of that. The Young's Literal Translation, it tells you it's literal. There's one called the Modern Literal Version, which you can look at, but I wouldn't use that as my regular Bible. And so there's a bunch of different translations that are kind of word for word-ish. But if you read those, especially the New American Standard, it's very wooden, right? It doesn't sound right to an English speaker because they're trying to maintain the sentence structure in Greek, and it doesn't work that way. You've been studying Latin.
Yes, sir.
Right? So what's Latin sentence structure like compared to English sentence structure? Do they correspond exactly?
The logic is very different. Like they'll, I think if I'm remembering correctly, they always put like the noun and then the verb that it's doing, instead of like we're running to the store, we to the store are running is kind of how it would sound.
Yeah, so it's a different logical construct, right? So you can't translate that literally into English. We to the store are running. You don't say it that way in English, right? That you're like, what? Just talk right. I mean, that's what you would say. And even there, that's not correct either. You would talk rightly because that's an adverb modifying the verb. See, language is hard. And when you start talking about Bible translations, you have all of those things piled in or piled on to this discussion. Do I want something that's really literal, or do I want something that's easier to read? And so it depends on what you're doing. If you're doing devotional reading, then I would recommend using a Bible translation that is more thought for thought, right? It takes, okay, this is the sentence structure here. We to the store are running. And instead of giving you that in English, it's going to change that and say, we ran to the store, or we were running to the store. And so, it changes the word order some, but it gives you the same idea, right? So like the NIV is good about that. The Christian Standard Bible is good for that. And then there are readings that, like maybe you're stuck. Like you're reading through a passage and you just have no idea what it's about. You just need somebody to kind of give you a general idea. What is this talking about? What you want then is a paraphrase, right? If you've looked at your word for word and you're like, I have no idea what Paul is talking about here, it's normally Paul when we don't know what he's saying. And then you move over and you're like, all right, I'm going to try like the NIV. I'm going to move more to a thought for thought. And you move over there and you're like, I still no idea. Them telling me what Paul is thinking isn't helping. So then you might move to more of a general like paraphrase Bible where they're like, okay, here's the general idea. And then maybe you can move back, step back up those ladders, up those steps of the ladder. Good paraphrase Bibles are like the contemporary English version and the Message, right? So those do not read those. If you want a word for word, here's what the Bible, the text in Greek says. It's not what those are. Those are, I'm totally lost here and I have no idea what's going on. I need somebody to put me on the map so I can even start to figure this out. Those are good Bibles for that.
So those like give you the general idea of a sentence or like a paragraph or whatever, and then you can go and see the actual wording and see if that like how the idea is being worded out, fleshed out in the text. Yeah.
There are things in Greek that when they're written in Greek, like you were saying with Latin, right? If you speak Latin fluently, all right, this makes a lot of sense. Mm-hmm. And if you know all the idioms, if you know the culture and all the things that are going on, you understand all the references, right? You get it. Like Paul will reference some Greek poets and playwrights. If you don't know those works, then when Paul quotes them, like he quotes bad company corrupts good morals, if you don't know what that's from and you don't know the context of that statement, you can misunderstand how he's using it. And so you need somebody to come along who knows all those things and say, this is kind of what it means, right? And there are other things that are just hard to understand, like Romans chapter 7, some of the stuff in there is hard to work through. And so you want somebody to kind of step back with you and say, here's the big picture. Then once you kind of get your head wrapped around what is the big picture, then you can step back down into a more literal Bible, into a more word for word or a thought for thought. You get closer to the original text. Obviously, the best thing would be to learn Greek, right? But not everybody has time for that, and not everybody is good at that. So you don't have to. That's one of the beautiful things about translations, is you don't have to learn Greek. The Word of God is not stuck in Greek, right? It is the idea that is expressed in those words. And so if you have somebody who can take that idea and put it into the English logical construct that is our language, then you get the idea, right? In fact, in Greek, it's called the logos. And the word meaning of the word logos, it can mean word, but it's also like the logic, right? That's where we get our word logic from, logos. It's the idea, it's the message, it's the meaning behind those words. And that's what we're after. And so all these different translations, whichever one you prefer, is a tool to help you get to that logos, to help you get to that idea. Whether it's the King James, the New King James, English Standard, it really doesn't matter. In fact, what I would recommend is getting a bunch of different Bibles, like maybe 4 or 5, that you kind of familiarize yourself with, and then work through each one of them. So like maybe read Romans 7, if that's what you're studying, read it in the King James one day. Then the next day, read it in the English Standard Version. Then the next day, read it in something else, and read it in something else. And each one of those different translations can be a tool to help you understand more what was said. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So in a way, each one of those translations is kind of like a commentary. Because when that committee or person or whoever translated it read the Greek, they're like, all right, this is what we think it means in English. So then you can take all of those, this is what we thinks, and you can look at them all and you can say, all right, the general consensus is that this is kind of what Paul meant. And if you don't speak those original languages, you just have to trust that those guys are doing a good job, that those people are doing a good job, right? So at the end of the day, when somebody says, what is the best Bible translation? It depends. You know, if you grew up with the King James Version and you're familiar with the King James Version and you're used to quoting all the scripture in King James, then just use that. You don't have to change. But I would recommend reading other Bibles too. And you're going to notice differences, and it doesn't make the other Bibles wrong. It just means that there's something now you got to figure out why are there differences. If you want something that's more literal, well, the New American Standard, the English Standard Version, the American Standard, if you really like big words, those are what you're going to want. If you want something more like give me the idea of what's here, the Holman Christian Bible, the Christian Standard Bible, the NIV. Right? If you want something I'm not even sure what this is about, then you're going to want the Contemporary English Version or the Message. Or something like that. So when somebody's, what's the best Bible? What are you using it for? And then don't use one, use several. Right? So when I study a passage, I can tell you how many I use. I read through, if it's in the Old Testament, I have the Septuagint. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
I think you skipped one.
Did I? So 11, 12, 13 different Bibles that I read it through, that I read a passage in.
Wow.
And so it's like having 13. Now that's if it's the Old Testament. If it's not the Old Testament, then there's only 12. Because I read it in the...
Because 12 is so much less than 13.
That's right. But the point of that is to get a feel, right? As you read it in each one of those translations, you get a feel for, all right, this is probably what is being said. So that's kind of that would be my recommendation when it comes to Bible translations, is use the one that you're most comfortable with, but don't just use that one. You know, use the tools for what they are designed to do, and reading 4 or 5 is probably the best, or more if you have it. I have that many because it's on the computer. Yeah. I mean, I don't have 12 Bibles open on my desk. That would just be crazy.
So what would you do in some Bibles I've read? Like my friend had one, I don't remember where it was, but we were reading through the New Testament and it switched the verses around.
Switched them around?
Like it was in a really long sentence of Paul's, but my verse 25 was his 26. And
oh, okay. All right. The reason...
Vice versa.
Sometimes it does that because of the word order. Sometimes, depending on what you're saying and how you're saying it in Greek, the word order doesn't matter. And so sometimes in English, one committee or person will think, if you word it, if you switch that sentence around, it makes more sense. Sometimes that's why. Other times it's because they have different textual families, like we talked about at the beginning. And as you read through those different textual families, they are in a different order. Now, the same stuff is there, it's just in a different order. And the weird thing is that it doesn't seem to affect the meaning very much.
No, not usually.
So, I mean, if it does, that the scribe would have gone, wait, that doesn't make sense, right? And probably fixed it. So that's why.
Okay. But is that, would that be a problem when you're cross-referencing the different translations?
No, because you'll see it.
Okay.
If you know that the Bibles are going to have some differences in them, then you're aware, you'll look for them, and when you see them, they don't scare you. Because some people, if they're not aware, and that's okay, you just have to figure out why the differences are there. But some people, when they see any differences at all, they think it's bad, and they're like, "Oh no, what do we do?" And it's not bad. There's a reason why there's differences, and there's a good explanation for it. So don't let that scare you. If you're looking at different Bible versions and a verse is missing from one, or the verses seem out of order, it's okay. Don't worry. There's a reason why. And if you happen to read that and you remember that we talk about it here, you can email us or text us or however you want to get in touch with us and ask. And we'll be happy to talk about it. All right. So that was one thing we want to talk about. The next thing we wanted to talk about, what was it? Let's see. let's talk about bad things happening. Why do bad things happen? We're actually going to talk about this in our Bible class on Sunday to some degree.
So this is our teaser.
It's a teaser, yeah, for Bible class. You should come to Bible class. We're going to talk about bad things. Whenever I hear that phrase, bad things, I always think of, there was a commercial from the 90s with, was it Dennis Hopper? Was that his name? There was a guy and he would go, bad things, man, bad things. Anyway, so that's what I think of.
Okay.
It was a sports commercial, I think. I don't remember. It was on TV. So in chapter 11, let's pull our Bible up.
Chapter 11.
Chapter 11. John, chapter 11.
Okay.
John, chapter 11. So here we've got our Bible up. And what happens in chapter 11 is Lazarus dies. So Jesus is going to hear that Lazarus is ill. Somebody's going to come. Jesus heard, let's see. I can't see, the microphone's in the way. All right, so the brother is ill. Then Jesus is going to hear about it. When Jesus hears about it, he says, don't worry, this isn't going to lead to death, but it's for God's glory. Well, kind of to ruin the story for you, if you haven't read it yet, he dies. But here Jesus said it doesn't lead to death. How can he say that if Lazarus dies?
I don't know.
That would be me like saying, this sentence doesn't lead to me punching you. But then I hit you. Why?
I have no idea.
Okay, so what Jesus means is death isn't the end of the story. Right? Just like me punching you is not the end. I'm sorry. Oh, see, it led to reconciliation. So Jesus says this doesn't lead to death. In other words, that's not where it's headed. So if you're going on a trip to Philadelphia, you're driving from Nashville to Philadelphia, and you go through Knoxville, right? Your trip didn't lead to Knoxville. Your trip is leading to Philadelphia. You just happen to go through Knoxville on the way. I don't even know if that's on the way. I'm assuming it is.
Or in some cases, when you're headed to West Virginia and you go through Bucksnort.
Bucksnort. My favorite town in Tennessee so far, the name at least, is Bucksnort, Tennessee. You should go if you haven't. It's amazing. So we purposefully stayed there just because we wanted to say we stayed in Bucksnort, Tennessee. Okay, so if you're going to Philadelphia and you drive through Knoxville, your trip didn't lead to Knoxville. Your trip led to Philadelphia. You just happened to go through Knoxville. And so when Jesus says this sickness doesn't lead to death, he's really not saying Lazarus isn't going to die, because in just a minute, he's going to tell his disciples Lazarus is asleep, and they're going to say, well, then he'll just wake up. And he's like, no, he's dead. Right? So you have Jesus in one instance saying this doesn't lead to death, and then like the next day, he goes, Lazarus is dead, by the way. Why didn't his disciples go, dude, you just said this doesn't lead to death, and now you're telling us he's dead? Now, I don't know if the time, maybe they did say that and it's just not recorded. They all like looked at each other weird, because sometimes Jesus says things and nobody understands what he means until later.
Like when he talks about the temple of his body.
Yeah. So I imagine the disciples, there were lots of times where they had weird looks on their faces because they just didn't understand what he's talking about. And that's a warning for us. If you think that you always understand Jesus, then you probably don't. Right? One of the signs, I think, of somebody who is well-versed in the Bible is that when they come to the New Testament and they read what Jesus says, they're like, I have no idea what he means. Or I'm not exactly sure what he means here. I'm going to have to think about that. Because there are times where Jesus says stuff, and at first glance, when you just hear what he says, you're like, wow, what? You can't say that. Right? And then later you're like, oh, okay, now I get it. So the same thing happens to us when we come to the text. Jesus says things that are shocking, or he says things that don't make sense until you get to the end of the story. And so the disciples hear this, that doesn't lead to death, and then the next day, oh, by the way, Lazarus is dead. They'd be like, huh? What? And then they go, and Jesus raises him from the dead. But in the meantime, Martha, one of his sisters, runs up to him and says, if you had been here, he wouldn't have died. Right? And then Mary will say the same thing. If you had been here, he wouldn't have died. And they're right. Maybe. I mean, could Jesus have healed Lazarus?
Definitely.
Lazarus? Yeah, he could have. If he wanted to. But he didn't want to. Right? He knew Lazarus was sick, and what does he do?
He let him be sick.
Yeah, he waited. He was going to go visit, but he waited until he was dead. In fact, when Jesus gets there, Lazarus has been dead for 4 days.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's without embalming. So it was not pretty after 4 days. He's entombed. They had the funeral. He's there, and I mean, the guy's been dead. Mm-hmm. And so we can ask the question, well, if Jesus could have stopped that, why didn't he? If he knew that Lazarus was sick, and he could have stopped Lazarus from dying, why didn't he?
Like the centurion's servant.
Yeah, the centurion comes, says, my servant is sick, and Jesus says, fine, he's better. And the centurion goes home, and he's better. Why didn't he do that with Lazarus? See, he didn't even have to go to Lazarus. You're exactly right. He could have just turned around and said, just go home. Lazarus will be fine when you get there. But he didn't. So we have to ask the question then, why did Jesus allow this bad thing to happen to Lazarus, especially when the text emphasizes many times how much Jesus loved this guy? They were really good friends. Well, why did he let him die?
I don't know.
That's a good answer. The text actually says, right here, we've got it highlighted, it is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. In other words, Lazarus is going to die so that I can bring him back from the dead. Now that he doesn't say that yet, but he's saying this is going to happen so that God will be glorified. Sometimes we forget that we aren't the hero of the biblical story. Or the Bible isn't about me. The Bible isn't telling me how great I am. The Bible isn't telling me how perfect I am. It's not telling me how wonderful I am. In fact, it tells me often the exact opposite of those things. The Bible is about Jesus. In fact, one of my favorite things, I mention it a lot, is that in American Sign Language, the Bible is, I got to put my hands up where you can see it, the Bible is the Jesus book. That's Bible, Jesus book. Right? I mean, that's what it is. It's the book that shows you Christ. And so Jesus is the hero of the story, not me, not you, not anybody. Jesus is the hero of the story. And as people who are still today part of that biblical story, right? The story doesn't stop in Revelation. We're still part of the story of Christianity. As that story continues, we're minor characters in the play. And so in Star Trek, if you're wearing a red shirt and you don't have a name, what's going to happen?
Or if they make up your name and you can tell it's very quickly made up.
Yeah. Ensign going to die soon. Right? Yeah. Woo. It's not your day. Right? If you're in a red shirt in Star Wars and you go on an away mission, nice knowing you. Star Trek, yeah.
Now, if you're like a clone trooper in Star Wars?
Yeah. Same thing. Not going to be a good day for you. Yeah, so you know that, okay, we expect all of those people in the red shirts, they're all going to die. Right? It's kind of the same thing. And I don't mean to look at it in a very light, frivolous way, because human suffering is real, and Jesus is going to cry when Lazarus dies. Mm-hmm. But if I suffer so that God can be glorified, so be it. Right? We forget that God's glory is the primary element of what is going on. And Lazarus was sick and died so that God could be glorified. In the story of Job, all the terrible things that happened to Job, at the end of the book, Job all along has been saying, if God would just show up, I would put the question to him. I would force him to give me an answer. And God shows up and says, Job, you don't even get to ask questions. Who are you? He said, in fact, let me ask you some questions, and if you can answer them, then you can talk to me. And God just goes through this series of things. Where were you when I made this? Where were you when I made this? Where were you when I did this? Can you do this? Can you tame the storms? Can you grab Leviathan out of the water? And so he asks him all these questions, and the answer is no. And Job at the end realizes that I don't even have the right to question God. And so he says, I repent. I cover my mouth. I repent in dust and ashes. And that's kind of where we are. Something terrible could happen to me. But God is able to bring about good from everything. And so, yes, it's terrible that Lazarus dies. Everybody wished that he didn't, but God is able to bring good out of that death. And that's here in verse 4, that this is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God will be glorified through it. He's going to raise him from the dead. And the result of that is a really good thing. Let's scroll down. So he's going to raise him from the dead. And here's the result. Many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary, saw what he did and believed in him. So is it a good thing for Lazarus to die?
Yes.
Yes, because Jesus raised him from the dead, And when he did that, he was glorified. God was glorified as well. And people came to believe that Jesus was who he said he was, the Messiah. And then they, believing, have what?
Whom?
The people who came to believe.
Oh.
What do they have then? If they believe in Jesus, what do they have?
What?
Why did John write his gospel? Do you remember? You're in the hot seat. That's an idiom.
As a testament?
I write these things to you who believe in the name of Jesus Christ, or so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ. I was mixing up 1 John 5 and this. So that by believing you may have
life in his name.
Yeah, so when these people came to believe, what did they have?
I guess they had life in his name.
Yeah, eternal life. So Lazarus died for a little bit. I mean, really, that's all will be dead, is a little bit. And when Lazarus died, a bunch of people got eternal life. Was that worth it?
Definitely.
That was a good thing. And so part of the problem is our perspective is not right. We look at things from a very temporal perspective, and God is looking from an eternal perspective. We look for our good. We don't want to get sick and die. But when Lazarus got sick and died, look at all these people who became believers when Jesus raised him from the dead, right? So sometimes God does things, and it's not, I don't perceive it as good right now, but God brings good out of it. Other times, bad things happen because I'm dumb, right? I do things I shouldn't, or I'm not focused on what I ought to be focused on, and God punishes me.
What about Paul? He mentions sometime, I can't remember where, but he mentions, we were talking about this a few weeks ago, it's like the thorn in the flesh or whatever. Mm-hmm. And he's talking about how he prayed for it to go away, but God didn't remove it.
Yep.
So why is that? Okay,
we'll go there next. So I just wanted to look at this really quick. So here in Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 5, God addresses us as sons, right? Do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord. So God disciplines us, and he disciplines the ones that he loves, and he chastises every son he receives. So sometimes bad things happen because we're not focused on the things we ought to be focused on. And then you can scroll down, or you can look down, and at the moment, discipline seems painful rather than present, but later it yields the fruit of righteousness, right? So God does things sometimes to produce in us the fruit of righteousness, and we have to realize that sometimes we need that. Just like little children need their parents to correct them, and don't stick your finger in the light socket, don't run out in the street, don't play with knives, all those things, because you're training the child to live as a human, and that's what God does. He trains us to live as his humanity, as his people. And so the thing you brought up over in 2 Corinthians 12
that's right.
is where Paul asks about this vision in the flesh, right? So or this thorn in the flesh. So he has this vision, and he gets to see up into the third heaven.
What's that mean?
Where God dwells.
Okay.
Yeah, so he gets to see that. And then it says in verse 7, so to keep me from becoming conceited because of the greatness of these revelations, a thorn was given me in the flesh. And then it's defined. A lot of people want to go, well, what is the thorn in the flesh? Here he tells you, a messenger of Satan to harass me. Right? So what does that mean? This word messenger is the Greek word angelos.
Like an angel.
Like an angel of Satan. It's just a messenger. Right? So it could be like the Judaizing teachers. The Jewish teachers followed him around all the cities, and they stirred up trouble.
Yeah. And
so it could be that. It could actually be that there was like some demon that followed him around, and maybe that's why the Judaizing, who knows. But whatever it is, Paul calls it a messenger of Satan. And the purpose of this, the reason why he had it, is to what?
To keep him from becoming conceited.
Yes. So if God didn't do that, if Paul didn't get this thorn in the flesh, he would have become conceited. He would have fallen back into his own prideful thinking. That was his trouble before. When he was persecuting the Christians, he didn't think there was any way he could possibly be wrong, because he, after all, was Saul of Tarsus. Mm-hmm. And so arrogantly, he just, out of hand, dismissed what the Christians were saying because he knew that he was right. And so we know that Saul, same person, had this tendency toward pridefulness. And so to keep him from falling into that trap again, God gave him this thorn in the flesh. Now, was it pleasant?
No.
No.
But it's kind of like with Lazarus, though, because Lazarus suffered and died, but after his suffering, or I guess kind of because of his suffering, he came back, but he also caused the blessing of all these people getting to meet Jesus and learn about him. And then Saul, he's suffering too, but he also got a blessing because of it. Like, even though he's suffering now, he also got to see into heaven.
Yeah.
I'm kind of jealous.
Yeah. And Paul would never have to doubt his belief in the resurrection. His belief in everything that he taught, because he saw it.
That would make it pretty solid.
Yes. Same thing with Lazarus. Lazarus is never going to have to doubt his belief in the resurrection because he was raised from the dead. He's probably going to believe in Jesus for the rest of his life. And so even though he went through that sickness and death, when he came back, man, the rest of life now is a breeze. He has nothing to be afraid of. Paul, nothing to be afraid of. And you can see that in Paul's faith. He is fearless. He goes places people wouldn't go. He says things people wouldn't say. He talks to people nobody else would talk to. The dude is fearless. Why is he fearless? Because he saw heaven. He knows what awaits him. Why would you not do that? Right? And so, yeah. But that gets back to Hebrews 12, how the discipline seems unpleasant for a time, but it yields the fruit of righteousness. And we see that in both of those cases. So sometimes bad things happen so that God can be glorified. Sometimes bad things happen for a good reason for other people. Something bad could happen to me, and it benefits other people. Sometimes bad things happen to me, and it benefits me. It's chastisement. It produces in me the fruit of righteousness. Sometimes bad things happen because somebody else made a terrible choice. If somebody else chooses to drink and drive, and then they kill you, well, you died because they made a bad choice. Right? And in that instance, that's why.
Like the Christians who were being persecuted by Saul didn't necessarily do anything to deserve it. They were just being persecuted because Saul was making the wrong decision.
Yeah. And unfortunately, that is a consequence of sin. Where sin is, death is there. And we live in a world that is full of sin, so the world is full of death. And when people make bad choices, sometimes people get hurt. That's the consequence of sin. And we don't like that. And we kind of balk at that, and we say, if God was just, he would have stopped it. Well, he's going to do better than that. He's not going to stop it. He's going to undo it. And he's not just going to undo that one sin. He's going to undo all sin. And he's going to take everybody back and make it like it was before sin came into the world. And so when we argue that God isn't just, it's not that he's not just, it's that he hasn't acted upon his justice yet. And so there is a day coming in which the justice of God will roll down like the waters. It is coming. As sure as the sun will rise tomorrow, it is coming. And we are impatient. And so when people cry out and they say, where is the justice of God? They're impatient. The answer is, it's coming. Wait. Just like when bad things happen to us and somebody gets arrested, now we have to go through all the court procedures for justice to occur. We want it to happen like immediately, but it's going to be years sometimes, right? Court cases take years to go through. And that's just the way it is. It's coming. And God does not act immediately because God is gracious and patient. I don't want God to act immediately when I do something wrong. I don't want him to strike me dead. So why would I want that for other people? I don't.
Yeah.
I want God to be patient. All right, I think that's pretty good for tonight. So we'll go ahead and leave that there. We're thinking about moving this to Thursdays. I have a Bible study that I do with some guys that is really awesome, and we do that on Thursdays at 8. So we're going to move this to Thursdays at 7. And so we're thinking about moving it to Thursdays. A lot of people are not available on Friday nights, or they have things they do with their families, and so we think Thursday might be a better day. Let me know what day is better for you, Thursdays at 7 or Fridays at 7, and we'll see what's going on. Okay? Thank you for joining us. This has been a lot of fun. Again, if you have questions, don't forget to submit them. Wherever you happen to see this, you can just comment and ask your question, and we'll talk some more next week. Thanks.